Hello. Did you know that the average person sheds more than a pound of skin a year? Ew. Yes, it is true. Welcome to Chapter 5, the integumentary system. So we're going to be talking all about the skin in this chapter, and the skin has several names. Skin, obviously, the integument, and, as we mentioned in the previous chapter, the cutaneous membrane. The skin has quite a few functions, which we will get to shortly. But let's talk a little bit about what the skin looks like. So here we have the integumentary system. And here you have a artist's rendition of the cutaneous membrane. Kind of like the cell, these structures are not this size. That's okay. As long as you see and understand the parts, it kind of doesn't really matter. So the cutaneous membrane is divided up into three major sections. You have the epidermis on the top, and the epidermis is the layer of tissue that does not have a blood supply. You can see all the blood vessels are deep to the epidermis, which means that oxygen and nutrients have to be diffused into the epidermal layer. So the second layer, the deeper layer, is the dermis, and this is where really all the action takes place, because this is where you have your glands. Like here's a sweat gland. These green things are sweat glands. And you can see it's an eccrine sweat gland. It opens to the outside world. And you also have hair, of course, in the skin. All of your skin is covered with hair, except for a couple of places. And an oil gland right here that helps lubricate the hair as it's making its way up and out of the epidermis. You also have these, which are part of the nervous system. This is a pressure receptor. And you have different kinds of receptors all over your skin. And in certain places, like your hands and your feet, you have way more receptors per square inch than anywhere else on your body. And it gives us that really fine touch. And of course, you have blood vessels here. Okay, so the cutaneous membrane having these three layers, nothing really happens in the epidermis. The dermis has a lot of stuff going on there, and then you have the hypodermis, which just means below. The hypodermis is actually a areolar tissue, which means it's kind of loosely packed, and adipose tissue, which you know as fat. So this adipose and areolar tissue actually anchors the skin to the underlying tissue. Now, the hypodermis does have blood vessels, but more importantly has the adipose, which of course is going to insulate, and also to help maintain our body temperature. Now, we're going to move on because we'll talk about all of the individual structures here when we talk about the glands of the skin. So this is a membrane, but it's also a system because of all of the different pieces here that are working together. Oops, wrong way. All right, so here are the layers of the epidermis, and I know I didn't mention it, but we are on page 72 now in your book. The layers of the epidermis have different names, and there are roughly 4 or 5 layers, depending on where you are in the body. What you see here, of course, 1, 2, 3, 4 separate layers. There is a 5th layer. The 5th layer is called the stratum lucidum. That is not in your book anywhere. The stratum lucidum. Lucidum. The stratum lucidum means clear layer. If you know the word lucid, lucid means clear. So the stratum lucidum is a clear layer. And it's clear because it's basically fluid. So you find the stratum lucidum in areas with a lot of rubbing, like the soles of the feet. Most of the rest of the skin just has the 4 layers here. What you have on the bottom is the stratum basal or stratum germinativum. So this is the basement layer or the germinating layer. And what that means is that these cells here are constantly replicating. So these are undergoing mitosis all the time. And as the identical daughter cells are produced, they push up into the next layer. And as they keep getting pushed up, they actually start to flatten. And when they start to flatten here, their nuclei start to disappear. You can still see some little blue spots here. Those still have some nuclei. But at this point, the nuclei are starting to disappear, and the cells themselves are being filled with something called keratin. Keratin is your body's waterproofing protein. So keratin is really important in a lot of different structures, especially in the skin and the hair and the nails. And what it does, of course, is waterproofs, but that's important because every time we got in the shower, if we didn't have keratin in our skin, we would blow up like SpongeBob, which would be bad. So once our epidermal cells get to this final layer here, this stratum corneum, they are flat, there's no nucleus, they're keratinized, they're filled with that waterproofing protein. And as they reach the top, they just slough right off. They just peel off. Now, the reason that this is called the stratum corneum is because these cells, which are, again, just dead, flat, keratinized cells at this point, look like corns of salt. Now, you may or may not have ever seen corns of salt. It's big blocks of salt that ultimately get shaved down, and the larger bits are called corns. Now, this is what they use to make corned beef. So corned beef is packed in those big, large corns of salt, and it helps preserve the meat. And of course, if you've ever had corned beef, it does taste very salty. So that is actually why this is called the stratum corneum. Just the appearance of these skin cells reminded someone of corns of salt. And there you go. Okay, so those are the layers of the epidermis. Your book does mention keratin on page 72 in a little green box. And we will come back to keratin a little bit more when we talk about, again, the hair and the nails and things like that. Keratin is actually produced by keratinocytes. Makes sense. And of course, as the cells flatten, they fill with the keratin and then get pushed up and off. And this right here is why you lose more than a pound of skin a year, because the skin cells individually are sloughing off every moment of every day. And in fact, if you have a nice bright window through which sun is shining, you see those lovely motes of dust. Well, some of it is dead skin cells flying through the air from you or the people that you live with. And that's a lovely thought also. Okay. There's one more thing. The life lesson at the bottom of page 72. It's about subcutaneous and intradermal injections. I just want to talk a little bit about those words. Obviously, as a massage therapist, you're not going to be injecting anybody, so it doesn't really matter. But subcutaneous, what are we really talking about? Well, subcutaneous means below the cutaneous membrane. So the needle has to go down in to the hypodermis, essentially. Subcutaneous injections can be anywhere within that layer. And intradermal just means in the skin, or I'm sorry, in the dermis, of course. So these are going to be shallower injections right underneath the epidermis, which I know it looks kind of big here, but it is not. The epidermis is extraordinarily thin, especially when you get up here with the flat dead layer, which is fun to think about, all the skin that you see on everybody else, the people you live with, the people you pass on the street, it's all dead skin. That's what you're seeing. Yeah, but these layers are not very big, not at all. In fact, if you ever had a paper cut and it bleeds, well, that's so shallow, right? But you hit the dermis because the epidermis doesn't have blood vessels. So you know you had to have hit the dermis because the dermis does have blood vessels. So again, very, very shallow here. Looks like a lot, but not really. Okay, when we come back, we are going to talk about skin color. Gonna stop the share, end the video, and I'll see you soon.